Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. In this video, we're taking a look at metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. Let's not waste any more time. Let's jump into it. So to begin, you should have already watched the respiratory acidosis alkalosis video I made. If not, I suggest you pause this, go and watch it. The link is in the description below. It sets you up really nicely. So I'm assuming you've watched that. We know this beautiful equation. You need to understand this equation anytime you talk about acid-base balance. It's called the bicarbonate buffer equation. And I said to you in the respiratory acidosis alkalosis video that every single day, through the process of metabolizing carbohydrates and fats, you produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct, right? And you end up producing 15,000 millimoles per day of carbon dioxide. That's around about 336 liters of carbon dioxide being produced just from metabolizing carbs and fats. Now, importantly, that carbon dioxide could obviously accumulate in your body and push this equation in this direction to produce hydrogen ions, making your blood acidic. That is what we would call a respiratory acidosis. But thankfully, that carbon dioxide can be managed through our respiratory system. So that's the respiratory control, is that if CO2 increases to result in an increase in hydrogen ions, that means you become acidic. That's called a respiratory acidosis. If your carbon dioxide levels go too low to result in too low or too little hydrogen ions, that's a respiratory alkalosis. Simple. But what we're referring to here is this. Every day, yes, you might be producing that, but you are also introducing around about 50 to 100 millimoles of acid directly. Now, what are these acids that we're directly producing? Well, for example, it could be sulfuric acid. And you might be thinking, where the hell are we getting sulfuric acid from? Well, we get sulfuric acid from amino acids that have sulfur-containing side groups, right? Like methionine is one of those amino acids, and cysteine is one of those amino acids, right? So through their metabolism, we produce sulfuric acid, and sulfuric acid is H2SO4. That's if you wanted to know that. You can also produce this acid every day through phosphoric acid. Phosphoric acid. Now, what's phosphoric acid? That's going to be H2PO4, but that's like metabolizing phospholipids, right? So phospholipids make up the phospholipid membrane, the membranes of our cells, and you can also get it from nucleotides, which make up our DNA. So we're obviously going to be breaking those down every single day. So that's how we produce the phosphoric acid. Now, we also produce what's called organic acids. Let's write it over here. Organic acids. And organic acids are acids that the body itself produces. So what are some examples of organic acids? It might be lactic acid, right? It could be pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid. It could be citric acid. It could be keto acids. So obviously we produce a bunch of acids in the body. So we can get it from amino acids, we can get it from phosphoric acids, we can get it from organic acids, and that's how we get that 50 to 100 moles per day. These acids that make carbon dioxide, they're called volatile acids because it means that we can produce it and then get rid of it directly. Here, we produce it and we can't get rid of it directly, right? Either we compensate over here or we have to deal with it directly on this side of the equation. So on this side of the equation, our kidneys or our renal system has to deal with it. So when we look at it, this side of the equation is dealt with by the respiratory system, very important because of the huge amount of carbon dioxide being produced and its capacity to produce heaps of hydrogen ions, or the renal system, which will deal with either getting rid of hydrogen ions or deciding not to, reabsorbing bicarbonate or producing bicarbonate, or not to, deciding not to. right? So let's now look at what causes a metabolic acidosis alkalosis. It has to do with this side of the equation and importantly, your kidneys. So a metabolic acidosis is defined as obviously a pH, right? So it's going to be having a pH below 7.35, and obviously a metabolic alkalosis is going to be a pH above 7.45. But what else do you see? For a metabolic acidosis, it's either going to be due to a increase in hydrogen ions, or it's going to be due to a decrease in bicarbonate. But you'll see both, right? Because by definition, if the pH is dropping, that's going up. And to compensate, it's going to bind to bicarbonate and that will drop. So you're going to see both of these, right? But you don't always know which one's going to be the cause, right? So let's push this down the middle and let's have a look at the different types of metabolic acidosis. All right, so if the metabolic acidosis is due to an increase in hydrogen ions, what could be causing that? Well, adding any of these into the mixture. So increase in the metabolism of sulfuric acid or phosphoric acids, right? May not necessarily be a major cause, but increasing organic acids, that can be a major cause. So it could be due to increased lactic acid, right? Now you might be thinking, Mike, you've said in a previous video that the body doesn't even produce lactic acid. And that's true. But importantly, what matters is this. When your body is hypoxic or it doesn't have enough oxygen, we know it undergoes alternate energy pathways like anaerobic metabolism. And in that process, we produce hydrogen ions as a byproduct. Okay, now a lot of people say that that's by producing lactic acid and lactic acid produces the hydrogen ions, but it doesn't matter for this conversation. Effectively, you could say that in cases of hypoxia, so what could cause hypoxia? It could be things like sepsis, it could be things like shock, it could be things like cardiac arrest, right? They cause hypoxia and that produces hydrogen ions, which we call lactic acid. So that could be a cause of metabolic acidosis. Or you can have an increase in your keto acids, right? In your keto acids. And so keto acids, remember, if you're a diabetic, right? You're a type 1 diabetic, your body can't utilize glucose properly for metabolism. So it starts to recruit fats and breaks fats down. And the breaking down of those fats produces ketones, also known as keto acids, beta-hydroxybutyric acid, known as beta-hydroxybutyrate, and acetoacetate, also known as acetic acid, right? They are acidic. So in cases of diabetes, uncontrolled diabetes, you can get an increase in keto acids. You can also get it through alcohol, and you can also get it through starvation, particularly if that starvation and alcohol is on a background of diabetes, right? So you can get it that way. So that's increasing those organic acids, right? So how else can we increase hydrogen ions? Well, it may not be through endogenous, it could be exogenous, like drugs, right? Drugs or toxins. So one important one is salicylates, like aspirin. And you might be thinking, Mike, I watched your respiratory acidosis alkalosis video and you told me that salicylates can cause a respiratory alkalosis. That's true. What was that mechanism? So if you take a lot of salicylates, right, in the early phases, they can directly stimulate the medulla, the respiratory center in the medulla, and you hyperventilate. If you hyperventilate, you get rid of the carbon dioxide, which means you don't produce enough hydrogen ions, and that's a respiratory alkalosis. So in the early stages of too much salicylates, you can get a respiratory alkalosis. But in the latter stages, the salicylates can decouple the mitochondria, resulting in what seems to be like a hypoxic state for the mitochondria, and it produces lactic acid. So you can actually get an increase in acids through the salicylates. You can also get it through methanol ingestion, don't do that, and ethylene glycol, which is antifreeze, don't drink that either, also can induce a metabolic acidosis. So this is adding acids to the body. But you can also get it not from adding acids, but just the kidneys not being able to pee the hydrogen ions out. So if you have something like renal failure, you can't pee hydrogen ions out, right? If you have something called a distal renal tubular acidosis, also referred to as a type 1 renal tubular acidosis, what can happen here is it just does not excrete hydrogen ions, does not excrete hydrogen ions. So here, you're not making hydrogen ions, you're just not getting rid of them. Here, you're making more hydrogen ions. But all of this can result in a metabolic acidosis. Okay, what about when we look at the drop in bicarbonate? What can cause the drop in bicarbonate? Well, where's bicarbonate mostly produced? Well, huge amounts are produced by the pancreas, right, to neutralize stomach acid and squirts it into the digestive tract. So if you have a lot of diarrhea, that could be getting rid of bicarbonate. So it could be due to GI loss, and that includes diarrhea. But you can also have loss from the kidneys itself. So you can have a renal loss. So if we have a look at, I spoke about the distal, you can have a proximal renal tubular acidosis. This is called a type 2 renal tubular acidosis. And it means the body cannot reabsorb bicarbonate. So the bicarbonate gets peed out. Here, we can't excrete it. Here, we can't reabsorb it, resulting in the same thing, a metabolic acidosis. Right, now one important point here is this. When I said, you check, you go, okay, my patient, their pH is below 7.35, it's acidosis. I don't know whether it's respiratory or metabolic yet. Wait a minute, let's look at the CO2, because I know if the CO2's up and the pH is down, so in acidosis, it's a respiratory. But you have a look, and let's say the CO2 is normal. Right, you go, CO2 is normal, but the bicarbonate's low, and the hydrogen ions are obviously up because that means that's down. You go, it's a metabolic, but I don't know if it's because I'm just accumulating hydrogen ions or I'm losing bicarbonate. So this is where the anion gap comes into play. I'm not going to go into detail because it's going to extend this video too much, but I have done a video, goes for 15 minutes max, on explaining anion gap very simply. It's in the description, click on that and watch that, come back to this video. But an important point to highlight for you is this. If you read your anion gap and you see that the anion gap, right, is normal, there's a normal anion gap, but you also get hyperchloremia. So that's, what's hyperchloremia? An increase in chloride, right? You go, oh, that's due to a loss in bicarbonate. And the reason why, and it might be confusing without watching the video, if you haven't watched the anion gap video, is because, remember, bicarbonate's an anion, chloride's an anion, negatively charged. So if you're losing bicarbonate, you want to maintain the right amount of negative stuff. So if you're getting rid of negative stuff, how are we going to maintain it? Chloride goes up to try and maintain it, right? So that's why we get the hyperchloremia. And as it goes up, it makes up for the loss. So if you lose 3 units, whatever that means, of bicarbonate, you'll gain 3 units of chloride. So you get a normal anion gap. So the amount of missing anions is normal. That's because of the loss of bicarbonate. Here, however, if you find that you have a high anion gap, it's telling you that it's due to not necessarily these ones here, but you're adding hydrogen ions. That's going to be due to adding hydrogen ions, right? Why? Because, again, just to make it more simple, if you have an acid, HA is an acid, right? Put it in a solution, it dissociates into the hydrogen ion and dissociates into its conjugate base, which is an anion. If you're adding hydrogen ions into a solution, right, or you're adding acids, I should say, into a solution, you're producing that, making yourself acidotic, right? But you're also releasing anions. Now, bicarbonate, if you're adding hydrogen ions, bicarbonate's going to try and mop it up to get rid of it and push it in that direction, right? So you lose bicarbonate. Now, in this instance, when you lose bicarbonate, chloride goes up to compensate so that you don't lose any negative stuff. That doesn't happen here because we've got the conjugate base to make up for the lost bicarbonate. So you get an anion gap because when you measure your anion gap, you're only measuring that and that. So it looks like there's a gap. So you get a high anion gap, and that's due to adding hydrogen ions. If that didn't make sense, please go to my anion gap video. I don't want to go into detail for that. All right, that's how you tell the difference between those two. Let's now look at metabolic alkalosis. So metabolic alkalosis, pH is above 7.45, and it's either going to be due to a loss of hydrogen ions or a gain in bicarbonate ions, right? So let's have a look. What could cause a loss in hydrogen ions? So this could be, where do we have a lot of hydrogen ions? In our stomach, right? It's because it breaks and helps to denature proteins. So if we were vomiting, so again, GI loss, but in this instance, it can be vomiting or like a gastric or nasogastric suction. You're sucking out gastric contents for whatever reason, right? You can also have it, and this is an interesting one, sustained hypokalemia. So that's low potassium in our blood plasma can cause a metabolic alkalosis. How? Let's have a look. So if you've got cells of the body, right? So let's say there's a cell, there's a cell, there's a cell, and there's the extracellular fluid, so the plasma, right, where that equation is sitting in this here. We know that if you had hypokalemia, the potassium out here is low, but you know that most of the potassium is in the cells. So to make up for the low potassium outside, the potassium in the cells will leak outside to try and compensate, to try and maintain the potassium balance in the extracellular fluid. But that means this cell is losing a positive charge. It doesn't want that. So it says, I'll only let you leave if you exchange for another positive thing. What's another positive thing it could exchange it for? Hydrogen ions. And so what ends up happening are the hydrogen ions basically get hidden in the cells. But that means out here, we're losing hydrogen ions. And you become metabolic, you get metabolic alkalosis. That's due to a sustained hypokalemia. So these are extrarenal causes of metabolic alkalosis. You can have renal causes of a loss of hydrogen ions. So that could be due to an increase, here's another interesting one, in mineralocorticoids. I'm going to move that. Corticoids. What are mineralocorticoids? Well, remember aldosterone, right? Aldosterone. So normally, the body will release aldosterone when we are hypovolemic. Our blood volume drops. It's like, ooh, our blood pressure is going to drop. I don't want to go into shock. Let's release aldosterone from our adrenal glands. And what does aldosterone do? So if I were to draw up a nephron, right? So here's the proximal convoluted tubule. Here's the loop of Henle, right? And here's the distal convoluted tubule. And here's the collecting ducts, right? And whatever goes out here is going to turn into P. We've also got our bloodstream that's following it, right? So it can reabsorb, and it does, reabsorbs like 99% of whatever it filters into this. So if it's in this thing, it's in our body. If it's in this thing, it turns to P and will leave our body. Important point. So if we have, let's say, too many mineralocorticoids, so that means too much aldosterone, that could be due to a primary aldosteronism, so that could be a tumor on your adrenal gland, or you can have Cushing's disease, right? Also leads to increase in aldosterone. Aldosterone, what it does is it goes, hey, I'm going to reabsorb sodium from the blood, and it goes, I'm going to take sodium, don't throw that sodium into, sorry, wrong way round. Don't pee the sodium out, reabsorb that sodium back into the bloodstream, right? Why? Because wherever sodium goes, water follows, right? So now we've got water back in our bloodstream, and I said aldosterone gets released to increase blood volume, right? So that makes sense. But again, like here, swap a positive thing for another positive thing. What do you think it swaps it for? It goes, okay, well, if you're going to do that, I'm going to swap you for hydrogen ions. And where do those hydrogen ions go? Out in the pee. So that's how we can get metabolic alkalosis, through too much aldosterone. There's another mechanism here that's happening, which is diuretic therapy. So you can have diuretic therapy. So that includes like the loop diuretics and thiazide diuretics. What do they do? So if you've got, let's say, heart failure, there's too much pressure on your heart, too much load, let's get rid of some of our blood fluid, our body fluid. If we get rid of that, then the heart doesn't have to pump as hard. There's less fluid to pump around. So let's pee out excess fluid. That's what diuretics do. And they do it by leveraging this fact that wherever sodium goes, water follows. So you give somebody a diuretic and it goes, okay, I'm going to act on the loop. I'm a loop diuretic, and I'm going to throw that sodium in the opposite direction. And it says, hey, yeah, I don't want the sodium in the body because the water's going to be in the body. I want the sodium to be in my nephron here, in the tubules, because if the sodium stays here, the water will stay here as well, and I'll pee out sodium and water and I drop my blood volume, right? But the problem, or not problem, but the kidneys don't know that what the intention is, right? All the kidneys see is, oh my God, I'm losing all this sodium in my pee. So here at the latter, the distal area of the tubules, it goes, hey, it does this thing, reabsorb more sodium because I'm losing too much. But what do you think it does? It swaps it for hydrogen and we pee it out again. And so we can also get it through diuretic therapy as well. Now, what about an accumulation of bicarbonate? There's one major way this happens, and that's through adding exogenous base. So basically exogenous bicarbonate. And we can do this through excessive antacids. So you go, oh, I've got reflux, I'm taking too many antacids, that's made up of bicarbonate. You increase too much of that. Or you could take an IV, so intravenous bicarbonate, right? That could do it as well. And so these are the causes of metabolic alkalosis. Now, let's quickly, before we finish, talk about compensation. So when you have metabolic acidosis, what does the body do to compensate? So in metabolic acidosis, your hydrogen ion levels are up, right? And bicarbonate levels are going to be down, but they're down because they bind to the hydrogen ions, unless they're actually down because of this particular loss. So hydrogen ion levels go up. We don't want this. How do we compensate? It binds to bicarbonate, dropping bicarbonate, pushes in this direction, turns to carbon dioxide, we breathe it out. So we hyperventilate. So compensation of metabolic acidosis, right? So compensation of metabolic acidosis is hyperventilation. So you might see a patient hyperventilating as a way to compensate, and it gets rid of CO2. So you might see in these patients that they're acidotic, right? They have an acidosis, but the CO2 is dropping as well. So that tells you it can't be a respiratory acidosis, because in a respiratory acidosis, the CO2 would be high because it's causative. But in this case, the CO2 is low as a compensation, okay? It's the flip side for metabolic alkalosis, right? If the hydrogen ion levels are low, well, we need to try and accumulate them somehow. So we hold our breath, we hypoventilate to push the equation in this direction. So you get hypoventilation in a metabolic alkalosis. The problem here is that if you hold your breath or you breathe less, yes, you're holding onto the CO2, trying to re-establish normal acid-base balance, but you're not bringing in enough oxygen. You become hypoxic. So that's going to limit it. So in both compensatory steps here, you'll never go back to a normal pH. It will try to re-establish a normal pH. Neither of these compensatory mechanisms will bring you back to a normal pH. I'm Dr. Mike, and I hope that helps. Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe. We've got hundreds of others just like this. If you want to contact us, please do so on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Dr. Mike Todorovic, at DrMikeTodorovic. Speak to you soon.